Hey, what's going on? It's Dr. Mike T. Nelson here with intervention number 4. We're talking about the theory of NEAT. So non-exercising activity thermogenesis. And if you have no idea what any of that means, then you're in the perfect place. So as I mentioned, it is non-exercise. So in short, this is the amount of movement and twitching and everything else you do during the day that is movement and activity, but is not formally classified as exercise. So exercise is pretty much what you think. If you go to the gym and lift weights, or you're sprinting in a race on your bike or things of that nature, that's considered exercise. So NEAT is a component of all those things that are not classically thought of as exercise. So the main example of NEAT is just walking around. You can also toss in just daily activities. Sometimes you'll hear something called ADLs. So it's called activities of daily living. When I worked in the medical device industry, we talked a lot about that because we'd have implantable devices in people that would use a little accelerometer that would monitor ADLs, or how much people were moving around but were not formally doing exercise. Because there's some very good data that that's a good marker for health. And if you think about health, most people who feel better are going to move more. So they would have an implantable device that would use an accelerometer to track this. And now when we've got different Fitbit watches and all sorts of things, we can track this relatively easy. Now again, that's not going to count for everything, but it gives us a pretty good kind of surrogate to determine is someone moving around more or less. So non-exercise activity, thermogenesis. So all energy expended with occupation. So leisure time activities, even sitting is considered a form of NEAT, although it doesn't burn quite as many calories as standing. You can look at some research that from the University of Minnesota when I was there. We looked at some stuff in seated versus standing desks. So if you stand, right, there's going to be a little bit more energy that's going to be expended by virtue of keeping you in that upright position against gravity. So that is considered a form of NEAT. Ambulation, which is just a fancy word for walking and moving around. And other things too, like toe tapping, shovel snow, especially if you're in a snowy place like I am in Minnesota, playing guitar, dancing, singing, washing the dishes, etc. Right? So you get the idea. So we're looking at all those things of movement that are not classically thought of as exercise during the day. And one of those is actually even fidgeting. So it's pretty amazing how many more calories you can burn by fidgeting all day. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you should fidget, but because it is a movement, it does require calories. And those do add up over time. Probably getting tired of seeing this graph. And as you remember, NEAT here, for most people, is actually burning more calories than exercise. And I think that's a surprise to a lot of people. Now, of course, if you're training for an ultra endurance run or triathlon, or you're an American football player and you're practicing 2 a day, there are exceptions to this. But for the most people who go to the gym a couple times a week for maybe 45 minutes to an hour, NEAT is still going to be higher for them in terms of the total amount of calories that are burned than exercise. Which is why when we're doing our little interventions here, NEAT is being talked about before exercise because it has a greater role in terms of calories burned, and I find that it is usually more modifiable than exercise. I believe there's a study that says for someone to be considered a lifelong exerciser, they need to be exercising for about 2 years. So again, that 2 years compared to the lifetime, that's a pretty small percentage, and I'd say a very wise investment. But to try to sell someone who's new to doing exercise as a habit, that you need to do this pretty consistently for 2 years, seems like a very long period of time. This is probably me in the airports, that people who walk really slow and you get trapped behind them. Oh, it drives me bonkers. And not only that, I've done way too many gait assessments in my day, so I kind of unconsciously watch how people walk. And if you want to see some people move pretty horribly, spend a lot of time in airports. Not recommended. One thing we'll learn about NEAT is that it is incredibly variable. It varies a ton from one person to the next under different conditions, both feeding or what they call overfeeding experiments, underfeeding, right? So caloric restriction. And we'll talk about a study where they overfed people by 1,000 calories per day. And I'll give you a little sneaky hint at the takeaway. Some people in that study gained very little, and they were not formally exercising more. So even some people, by overfeeding them 1,000 calories per day, they gained weight, but really not that much. As we'll see coming up, some other poor saps were not very lucky in that department. So NEAT is very, very variable from one person to the next, right? So you hear a lot of people argue about, oh, it's all just calories in, calories out. Well, of course, calories are super important. We're just not there yet with the technology where we can, in free living subjects, monitor down to very precise levels of how many calories are coming in and coming out. Now, if you come into a lab, we can look at different things like metabolic wards, metabolic chambers, doubly labeled water, even indirect calorimetry. We have all sorts of kind of different methods where we can get pretty accurate with that. But again, that's in a very much contained lab setting, and not in individuals that are what they call free living, that just kind of wander around and go about their lives. And what we find is how much they move is very variable. And even more complicated is that part of that is conscious and part of that is unconscious, meaning that people don't know how much more or how little they moved, right? So if something is unconscious, you're going to not have a very good idea about it by what's going on unless you can get some type of direct monitoring. So I thought this was pretty interesting. I stole this slide directly from Levine's talk here. And what they're looking at here is energy intake from the NHANES data. So this super big area where you can grab all sorts of different data. I'll leave it at that for now. And sales of domestic washing machines versus obesity rate. Now again, this is associative data, so we always have to be kind of careful with that. But what we see is that if we look at energy intake here, you see energy intake goes down. And then kind of flattens out, but is slowly going up. And what we see is that that kind of corresponds to the percentage of the U.S. population with obesity. Right, so percentage, kind of going up here, and energy intake slowly kind of going up. And so we're looking at is the right hand of the graph is energy intake in calories per day, and the left hand of the graph, what we're looking at is sales per year. And what we see is that as these things go up, initially energy intake goes down, which I thought was kind of fascinating. And then over time, we're looking at automobile sales here, goes up, energy intake kind of plateaus. What we don't see here is energy expenditure, which would be very fascinating to see. But I thought it was interesting that when we see this large spike here up in a short period of time, and as the percentage of the U.S. is becoming more obese, we see that these sales in general are going up. So it's evidence that as we move less and less, we are not helping with the obesity epidemic. Now again, that's just associative data, so we'll have some other better data coming up here. So NEAT variability. One thing, as I've done these lectures for quite a while, is that overfeeding actually does cause an increase in metabolism. I think to a lot of people that's kind of surprising. Now, the kind of two gotchas with this is it doesn't mean that as you overfeed that you're going to lose weight per se, although there are some anomalies where that does happen. Again, that doesn't violate the calories in, calories out. As we'll see, some people, when you start overfeeding them, they start dramatically increasing their NEAT, and they actually move around more. So they start burning off more calories. But in general, it's a correct statement that as you are overfeeding someone, their metabolism increases. The other gotcha is that it may not increase enough to offset how much you are overfeeding them. Right? So if we do a real simple example, and we've got some hard data on this coming up. If we overfeed you by 1,000 calories per day, and we're using the term metabolism here kind of loosely, and you increase your metabolism by 800 calories per day, you're still short 200 of just breaking even, right? So over time, right, you've got a surplus over here of about 200, so you are going to slowly gain weight over time. The reason I put this in is that most people don't realize that overfeeding will result in an increased metabolism. Again, that doesn't mean that all of that is going to equate out, but eating more does bump up your metabolism. So this is a very cool study. This is from Harris. This is from some of Levine's early work. Weekly changes in basal metabolic rate with 8 weeks of overfeeding. If you've ever seen me present before, you've probably seen me talk about this study. One of my favorite studies. So this is one of the very classic studies looking at the effects of NEAT. So Levine is the main guy who coined the term NEAT. And what they looked at here is body composition and leptin in 16 healthy participants with overfeeding. So here's our timeline. We've got our baseline, and then we've got our 8 weeks here. And if we just look at the sheer numbers here, so basal metabolic rate, we see that in general it's kind of going in the upward direction, right? If we just roughly look at the numbers. And if we look at their weight, started at around 65, ending somewhere around here around 70. So weight is going up, right? And that's what we would expect. What I thought was pretty interesting, so we're looking at FFM, what's called fat-free mass. So everything in the body that is not fat. And again, a big component of that is muscle, but we've also got bone and structural tissue, and you can even see hypertrophy of some of the organs. And what we find is that fat-free mass actually went up more than I would have expected. From baseline here of 55 kgs to 57, which I thought that was kind of surprising. So just by sheer overfeeding, fat-free mass is going up. And what we would expect of fat mass goes up also, right? So we started here at 11, ended at around 13 on the average. And that's what you would expect with an overfeeding study. Leptin here started at 4.4 and ended at about 6.6. And again, that's what we would expect, right? So leptin is a hormone secreted by fat cells that's kind of like the long-term sort of body fat thermostat. And that's, again, an oversimplification. But leptin is involved in the signaling of how much body fat that you have. And when we overfeed people, we would expect that that is going to go in the up direction. And that's what we see. So from this study, again, we're looking at the same data here, just in a graph. So we've got our baseline here, 1 through weeks 8. And we're looking at changes in BMR. And what you see is that from week 1 to week 2, we get a pretty dramatic bump. And then it kind of goes down, and then it's slowly kind of going up, and then maybe down again a little bit. So what I like about this graph is that we would think that, ooh, it's this nice, neat linear response. And yeah, it's going in that direction, but it's not as neat as what we would want. Ha ha ha. And we see the biggest change in sheer number from week 1 to week 2. Then it actually goes down. All right, so again, based on just one study, and you put that in your brain and you start thinking that, maybe having sort of diet breaks every once in a while for maybe a week, maybe we can see a little bit of a bump in basal metabolic rate. Now the catch though is if this is very low, this is 100 here, we're still talking about very, very small numbers, right? So we're talking about a bump there of 100 calories per day, which isn't that much. So that's kind of the big downside with that. So change in BMR with overfeeding, this is from a literature review in the study. And the big takeaway is look at all these dots kind of all over the place. So the maximum change in BMR is around just maybe a little bit over 15% from a couple studies. And we've got some longer ones out here. Longest one was 120 days. But again, if we were to kind of average them, 10%-ish, right? So we see a change. It's kind of going in this direction. But again, it jives with this data that it's going up, but it's not a massive change. Still definitely on the smaller side. So one of the favorite movies of all time, Office Space. And if people just started walking around more, expending more NEAT, they definitely would be better. So this is from the Levine study here. Again, overfed them by 1,000 calories per day. So what happened to those calories? So fat mass gain, the mean was 389, and that's what we would expect. Again, fat-free mass gain, 43. So that's actually going up. Change in resting energy expenditure, what's called REE, right? So how many calories are they burning just hanging out at rest? Again, still positive at a 79. Thermic effect of food, which we haven't talked much about. Just how much energy does it take to process food? That went up. And changes in NEAT, 328. So the biggest changes we saw were fat mass gain, right? Which is what to be expected if you're going to massively overfeed people by 1,000 calories per day. And then the second one was changes in NEAT. And if you look at the standard deviations, they're very variable. And you can see this by looking at the range. So the range here on the low end, you've got some people that only gained 58. Other people that were at 687. Holy crap, that's a massive difference from one range to the other range. And if we look down here at NEAT, so a negative 98.3 to 692. So again, don't get hung up on the units or anything like that right now. What we're seeing is that some poor bastards down here, you overfed them, holy crap, they actually decreased their NEAT. So even though the mean was a positive, some poor bastards on the other end of the spectrum actually moved even less. So they get the double whack. So they get 1,000 extra calories per day, and they're moving even less. That's not good at all. But you've got some other people on the end that went really high, almost twice of the mean. So again, the variability in NEAT from the low end to the high end is massive. So individuals in whom overeating effectively activates NEAT dissipate as much as 69% of the excess energy as heat. So those less able to activate NEAT store a higher proportion of excess calories as fat. Again, so this is telling us that some people, right, whether it's genetics or maybe other things we can control, it's probably still up for debate, they start dissipating as much as almost 70% of this excess energy as heat, right? So they're quote-unquote burning off this excess energy. And I would bet that those are probably people who are doing more of their things and moving around too. So again, very much different from one person to the next, which explains also why it appears that you have friends and other people who appear to sort of violate the calories in, calories out. All right, massive differences from one person to the next, but in the end, physics still wins. So increased metabolism varied a lot, right? So again, we're looking at very similar numbers here. right? So overfed, total energy expenditure in terms of kcals per day, the mean was 3,361. And again, pretty huge range on that. You can look at all the other numbers again. Again, same idea that we were seeing in the graphs before. So hopefully if you go running, you don't run into any new friends. Again, also from Levine. So what about the difference between lean versus obese people? Do we see any difference there? It's a very good question. So in time per day, if they're lying down, here we've got lean versus obese, not really statistically different in terms of looking at time here. So minutes per day. However, lean versus obese, right? So how much time they spend sitting. So lean people sit a lot less. That's interesting. Stand and ambulate. So how often they're standing and moving around. And what you see here, lean people are up and moving more than obese people, right? So kind of common sense, but again, always good to have data to show that, right? So what we're seeing here is a trend that people who are lean do more movement, right? Again, I know that's not earth-shattering, but very cool to see. So one of the sort of questions that I use with clients is, as they go about their day-to-day activities, and their goal is to be leaner, so increase body composition, one of the questions they can ask themselves is, what would a leaner person do? Would a leaner person sit more or stand more? They're going to stand more. Would they walk more or would they walk less? They would walk more. Would they take the stairs or the elevator? Probably take the stairs, right? So again, all those small little decisions, which then become habits over time, do matter. Again, looking at lean versus obese people in terms of the time that they ambulate, walk around, again, much higher for the lean person. Standing, standing still a little bit higher than the obese person. In this one where they're looking at neat, sitting in this case was about the same. Again, so more data to show that leaner people are expending more calories, not necessarily through exercise, but through NEAT. At the risk of beating the dead horse some more, one of the classic overfeeding studies from 1968 in Vermont, they found that body weight gain was lower than expected from the excess energy intake. This is one of the first of many overfeeding studies. And what they thought was that, okay, if calories in, calories out are the only thing that matters, and we assume this nice linear, direct relationship between them, we overfeed people, let's say by our mythical 3,500 calories, and they'll just keep gaining 1 pound per week as we overfeed them, right? So 3,500 calories kind of equates to about 1 pound. And that's generally true, although there's been more recent studies too, if you look up researcher Hall and some others, that association over time breaks down. And it's because people move around more and do other things. So this is the first study that showed that this nice linear relationship that we expected by body weight gain was lower than what they expected from the excess energy intake, which caused them to scratch their head and go, whoa, wait a minute. So it's not this nice linear relationship. What's going on? And energy expenditure increased with overfeeding as a dissipative mechanism to oppose weight gain. Right, so if you've ever heard the set point theory, there's some of the early data that showed that. Because it was not this nice direct linear relationship that they overfed these people and they didn't gain as much weight as they expected. What they found was that their energy expenditure, as we've been talking about, increased by virtue of them overfeeding them. So again, some other data here just quickly summarized. So continuous overfeeding studies. So body energy was stored at about 60 to 75% of excess. Right, so if we assume this was a direct and linear relationship, this should have been 100%. And what they found was it was not. That's when they saw the increase in energy expenditure. This was later tracked down to the obligatory cost. So we're maybe gaining some body protein, right? Because we saw fat-free mass went up, increased cost of walking, right? So if you're just out ambulatory or moving around and we increase your body weight, that movement is going to cost you more calories because it's going to take more energy to move around. So if you've ever gone for a walk with a 40-pound vest on or a very heavy backpack, or you're walking through the airport carrying stuff, you've obviously realized that it feels harder and you are burning more calories. So when you add body weight, the same thing happens because you still have to move that amount of mass around. So reduced energy expenditure appears to facilitate weight gain in individuals susceptible to obesity, and also appears to reduce the extent of body energy loss during undereating in both lean and obese individuals. So what the hell does any of that mean? So reduced energy expenditure, right? So we're reducing the amount of calories that we are expending, appears to facilitate weight gain, right? And that makes sense. So if we're expending less energy, that's going down, weight gain is going to go in the upward direction. In individuals susceptible to obesity, and also appears to reduce the extent of body energy loss during undereating in both lean and obese individuals. So again, while the calories in, calories out works, it's not this nice, direct, simple relationship. And at the risk of getting uber complicated, I won't spend too much time on this kind of mind-numbing graph here. There's some more recent data that shows that, okay, maybe we should divide this into 3 phases to try to get an idea of the mechanisms and things that are going on. And this gets into the theory of a set point, right? Where your body kind of wants to keep this sort of happy medium. So if your body weight, let's say, is 200 and you've been at that weight for quite some time, it's pretty easy for you to kind of fluctuate around that point. It's sometimes harder to gain and sometimes harder to lose, right? So it's the set point theory. Kind of like the thermostat in your house, right? If you set your thermostat to, say, 70 degrees, or if you come over to my house, you'll probably freeze because it's set to 65. It's going to try to keep the temperature right around that range. So what we're looking at here is changes. So initially when you're, let's say, decreasing calories in this case, which we're looking at weight loss, and then they're looking at the maintenance of reduced weight, because what they found is that those tend to be a little bit different from a mechanistic standpoint. Most diets are pretty good at producing weight loss, are pretty horrible at maintaining that weight loss. What's called recidivism of the lost weight is very, very high. Some of the literature will say it's pretty depressing at greater than 90%, meaning that a vast majority of people who were even successful with weight loss were not successful with maintaining that weight for a period of time, usually measured in many months to years, meaning that they regain the weight, right? Or what's called the classic kind of yo-yo dieting. So anyway, what they're looking at here is initially you're going to see a drop in fat-free mass. And part of this is just from fluid balance, sodium balance, things of that nature, right? So if you went and you dramatically cut your calories, you're going to see some changes in these things, which everybody's done that. If you've done a short fast, many times your body weight the next day will be down a little bit because of changes in those things. Insulin levels also dramatically go down. Glucagon goes up, leptin goes down, right? Because we're decreasing the amount of calories that are coming in. Thyroid goes down a little bit, measured by T3. Nervous system can go down a little bit on the sympathetic side, and etc. And then they're talking about, okay, well, maybe we've got phase 2 here, right? So phase 1, we're also looking at maybe we use a little bit more protein for fuel or protein oxidation, gluconeogenesis, etc., etc. So now phase 2, we keep doing this. What's going on? Well, we see an increase in lipid oxidation, again, in healthy individuals. Some people who are more metabolically inflexible, this may actually not go up as much. Again, depends on the person. Glucose oxidation tends to go down, right? So if we're dramatically dropping insulin, in general, the use of fat as a fuel is going to go up. Fat mass is going to start to go down, right? Because we're losing weight. Fat-free mass can go down too, especially if you're not doing any type of strength training or your protein is below where it could be. And we see other changes. Now in phase 3, they're saying, okay, here's our weight maintenance or our steady state phase. What's going on? Glucose oxidation may still be down. Lipid oxidation may be up. Protein oxidation is about neutral. Leptin is down, right? Because our set point here is lower than where it was before. Insulin down, and some of these other regulation hormones may still be down. And again, the whole takeaway of this is that the phase of weight loss, if you really want to get down into the weeds, has different consequences than the maintenance of reduced weight, which is why how you do weight loss is going to be directly related to how easy it's going to be to maintain that weight loss. If you do all sorts of crazy things and drop a whole bunch of weight really fast, maybe you lose some muscle along the way, or you're doing habits that you can no longer sustain, we don't really have any reason to expect that you're going to maintain that weight loss. And again, that may be okay if your goal wasn't maintenance, right? For whatever reason, maybe you had to cut weight for an event or things like that. But I always explain to clients that they have to know that that's going to be a temporary method. If you're a physique competitor trying to get on stage, then you have to understand that that's a temporary state and you are not going to stay there for a long period of time. For some people, that's a mere hours or even a couple days. So how you do weight loss is going to have a dramatic effect on how easy it is to maintain that weight loss. This is the takeaway from that slide. All right, so back to English. What does all this mean? So the comparison I use is we've got two people here. We've got our friend Barca Lounger Bob versus Peter the Painter. And we're going to assume that both of them are office workers. So total daily energy expenditure is 2,400. It's not super high, but it's not super low. It's a pretty good average number. Basal metabolic rate is 1,500 calories of that. And they've got a typical office worker type job for both of them. And they're going to be at home, we'll say from 5 to 11 p.m. And you can look up this case study. It has actually real numbers here. Fictitious people, though. So Bob comes home, and Bob loves his Barca Lounger. That is like his favorite thing. He's got his remote, so he doesn't even need to get off his butt anymore to go change the channels or do anything else. So energy requirements here above resting are not very much. And his NEAT is burning about 30 calories for that evening. So again, he's just not burning much, right? Because he's parked on his friend, the Barca Lounger here, and he's just not moving much. So he's really not burning many extra calories for that 6-hour period. Let's say we compare that to our friend Pete the Painter. Again, let's say he's doing his office work during the day, so he's got the same TDEE in terms of that. BMR, we'll say 1,500 calories per day, and he's at home 5 to 11 p.m. But let's say he gets home and he does a lot of movement. Since he's a painter, he finds, there's an unpainted bedroom, so he's going to go work on that. Maybe there's some weeds growing in the yard, so he's going to spend some time doing that. And maybe decides he's going to cycle back and forth to work. In this case, he could increase his NEAT by almost up to 1,000 calories for the same evening. Again, if we assume he's kind of up and moving around for those 6 hours. And what you find is that this is a massive difference for those 6 hours, right? We could have up to almost 1,000 calorie difference for someone who has a similar job and is, metabolically pretty similar. And so the takeaway here, again, is that movement, even all those other movements that you do that many people don't think count, that they do add up over time. So again, as we'll see in the action items, getting people to do more recreation, getting people to move around more is going to pay off in body composition. And it also goes without saying that these are not super heroic type movements, right? We're not asking them to go to the gym and do 2 CrossFit wads in the evening, right? It's maybe harder to recover from that. Not that there's anything wrong with high intensity exercise, definitely has its time and its place, but we're just looking at, can you just move around more and burn more calories? So what is our little NEAT summary here? So again, NEAT is a large contributor to total daily energy expenditure. It's highly variable from one person to the next. Some of that is based on genetics. Some of that's based on factors we probably don't understand yet. And you can look in the literature and find that there's different sort of subcomponents there too. But it's really variable from one person to the next. But as we saw in this example, a lot of that can be modified by your lifestyle, right? And that's primarily the big thing that's going to make the biggest change to it. And that's also the thing that you have the most control of it. It's unlikely you can go back and pick different parents right now. This gets into what's called the thrifty versus non-thrifty metabolism if you want to look into the research. And in the 5 actions video, we go over different things you can do. Use a pedometer or a watch, set a timer to get up and move, even just doing body weight squats in between. Park farther away, take the stairs, just add more non-exercising movements. And I know that in modern society, sort of low-intensity movements kind of gets bad-mouthed and all that low-intensity stuff doesn't matter. But what I found working with clients that over time, it does matter. And again, we've got more in the 5 actions videos there. But, 3,000 to 5,000 steps, I'd say, is a very rough minimum. And that's really not that much movement at all. 10,000 is good. I'd say that's a little bit of kind of a made-up number, though. And again, more is better up to a point, right? So it's not this nice, neat, linear response. Because as you start moving more, your body gets more efficient at movement. And so in terms of the sheer amount of calories burned, you actually start burning less calories. But again, some people hear that and they go, oh, well, I'm just not going to move. I'm going to, just be Mr. Slug and move at 2,000 steps per day. Nope. As you'll see in the follow-up video, there's all sorts of other reasons that movement is going to be helpful. And especially now with Fitbit watches and, I have a Garmin or Oura Ring or different ways of measuring it, even just the apps on your phone. Super easy to measure now and super easy to get an idea of a step count as a rough surrogate, right? Because remember, some of the NEAT movement is unconscious and some of it is conscious. So a lot of people don't really know how much they are moving or how much they are not moving. So again, just by having some numbers around it, gives you a framework to work and to increase that over time. So thank you very much. Greatly appreciate it. If you want more of the references and dig into it a little bit further, I've got more additional references here for you. Thank you very much.